So I'm 24 now, but this happened to me about 4 years ago, right when the pandemic was at its peak and everyone was cooped up at home. I was 20 at the time and working as a pizza delivery guy. You know how it was during those lockdown days? Places were either shut down or working on skeleton crews, and I had just moved out of my parents' house, trying to figure out how to get by. Delivering pizza wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. I never expected anything crazy would happen to me though. Honestly, I was just trying to keep my head down and grind through the shifts. Back then, I was working tirelessly. With all the lockdowns and restrictions, everyone was ordering takeout, so the delivery game was non-stop. I was pulling long shifts, biking all over the city, and barely had time to breathe. That was the life of a courier back then. You didn't have much choice if you wanted to survive, especially with rent and bills piling up. So I didn't think twice when this one particular delivery came through. I mean, I had done 1,000 deliveries by then, so what could be different about this one, right? Little did I know, this one would be burned into my brain forever. It's the kind of thing you don't talk about with just anyone, but now I feel like it's time to share. It was mid-October, one of those cold, rainy autumn days where it feels like the chill is seeping into your bones. I'm pretty sure it was somewhere around the 13th or 15th, because I remember the leaves were all turning, but the streets were a mess from the rain. I was out delivering on my electric bike, and if you've ever worked as a courier, you know the pain of forgetting to charge that thing. The moment you realize it, it's like a pit in your stomach because, yeah, you're gonna be late. I was already soaked to the bone, feeling the rain on my face, and I hadn't even hit the halfway mark of my shift yet. Anyway, this particular order came in from a luxury residential complex. You know, one of those high-end gated places that just scream money. It wasn't my usual route, but I took it anyway. I remember cursing myself because I had accepted a motorbike delivery, and here I was on a nearly dead electric bicycle. To make matters worse, this place was huge, and I mean massive. The kind of complex where it takes a solid 5 minutes just to find the right building, let alone the right apartment. I was running about 15 minutes late already, thanks to the bike battery situation, and I knew I was going to be even later wandering around this maze of buildings. When I finally found the right tower, I was relieved, but then I saw it was on the 22nd or 23rd floor, one of those numbers where you just groan inside. Elevators are cool and all, but when you're already running late and drenched, it feels like every second stretches out. I remember looking at the delivery instructions in the app, and it said something weird. Instead of the usual knock and leave or hand it over, it said I could just go inside and leave the order, no knocking required. Weird, right? I thought it was odd, but honestly, by that point, I didn't care. I just wanted to drop the pizza and head out to charge my bike before my next order came in. So I took the elevator up, still dripping wet, and finally made it to the apartment. I opened the door like the message said, and when I stepped inside, well, let's just say my jaw hit the floor. So I step into the apartment, and the first thing that hits me is how quiet it is. You know that dead silence where you can almost hear the hum of the air? It was like that. I was standing there, soaked from the rain, looking around at this absolutely immaculate high-end place. We're talking sleek, modern design, marble floors, expensive-looking furniture, the kind of place that instantly makes you feel like you don't belong if you're just a delivery guy. I could smell that faint scent of cologne mixed with whatever fancy air freshener rich people seem to always have. But then, as I'm taking it all in, I hear footsteps, and out comes this guy from one of the side rooms. And I swear, I'll never forget how I felt in that moment. The guy had just come out of the shower or something because he was wet, and I don't mean damp, I mean dripping wet. He was a solid 50 years old, maybe a little older, but damn, he was in crazy shape. Like, gym rat for years kind of shape. Pumped up, broad shoulders, chiseled abs, thick arms. He looked like he spent every day working out, and it showed. He had this silver fox thing going on, his hair still slick with water, and he was only wearing white underwear, which of course was tight enough that you could see pretty much everything. The guy, who I later found out was named Martin, didn't even seem fazed by the fact that he was standing there in his underwear. He greeted me casually, which made it even weirder because I was the one feeling all awkward. I was standing there with my hat still on, pizza bag over my shoulder, dripping wet like some drowned rat, while this Adonis of a man just calmly walked over to me. And then it hit me. I was late, really late. I had totally forgotten about the pizza being cold at that point, but suddenly it rushed back and I was hit with this wave of guilt. Like, here I am, standing in this guy's apartment, 20 minutes late with a soggy pizza, and he's not even mad. I figured my tip was as good as gone. So I start fumbling, trying to take off my hat and bag, apologizing like crazy. I mean, I was already expecting him to tell me to get the hell out or something, but instead he just smiled. A weird, appraising kind of smile, like he was sizing me up for something. He walked over to grab the pizza from me, and in that moment, I realized he wasn't just looking at me like I was the pizza guy. His eyes lingered on me in this way that made me feel like I was part of the meal. He took the pizza into the kitchen, casually mentioning that he had a microwave to warm it up, which kind of saved me from more apologies, I guess. But then he told me not to leave. He didn't say why, just that I should stay put. Now, at this point, I was confused and yeah, maybe a little curious too. I figured, okay, maybe he's going to give me a tip and wants me to wait while he gets it or something. But then he comes back with a $100 bill in his hand. I remember my heart literally skipped a beat when I saw that cash because, dude, $100 for a cold pizza delivery? That's insane. I've gotten tips before, but nothing even close to that. I thought, okay, maybe this guy's just super rich and generous, but then he said something that completely changed the vibe. He looked at me with that same strange smile and said I could still make amends for being late and get that $100. At first, I didn't really get it, so I just asked, like an idiot, what I needed to do. I didn't think much of it. I mean, my brain was still catching up to the whole situation, the weirdness of being in this luxury apartment with a half-naked, wet guy offering me $100. But then he leaned in a bit, and I could feel the tension in the room shift. He didn't need to spell it out. The way he looked at me said it all. Suddenly, it was crystal clear what he meant, and I swear, I felt my heart start racing. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was the exhaustion from working non-stop, or maybe it was just the sheer intensity of the moment. But something in me just gave in. I mean, I was standing there, wet. The guy, who I later found out was named Martin, didn't even seem fazed by the fact that he was standing there in his underwear. He greeted me casually, which made it even weirder because I was the one feeling all awkward. I was standing there with my hat still on, pizza bag over my shoulder, dripping wet like some drowned rat, while this Adonis of a man just calmly walked over to me. And then it hit me. I was late, really late. I had totally forgotten about the pizza being cold at that point, but suddenly it rushed back and I was hit with this wave of guilt. Like, here I am, standing in this guy's apartment, 20 minutes late with a soggy pizza, and he's not even mad. I figured my tip was as good as gone. So I start fumbling, trying to take off my hat and bag, apologizing like crazy. I mean, I was already expecting him to tell me to get the hell out or something, but instead he just smiled. A weird, appraising kind of smile, like he was sizing me up for something. He walked over to grab the pizza from me, and in that moment, I realized he wasn't just looking at me like I was the pizza guy. His eyes lingered on me in this way that made me feel like I was part of the meal. He took the pizza into the kitchen, casually mentioning that he had a microwave to warm it up, which kind of saved me from more apologies, I guess. But then he told me not to leave. He didn't say why, just that I should stay put. Now, at this point, I was confused and yeah, maybe a little curious too. I figured, okay, maybe he's going to give me a tip and wants me to wait while he gets it or something. But then he comes back with a $100 bill in his hand. I remember my heart literally skipped a beat when I saw that cash because one minute I was just a pizza guy battling the autumn rain on my e-bike, and the next I was in this luxurious apartment, caught in an intimate moment with a fit, handsome man who seemed to radiate confidence. There was a part of me that was still processing everything, questioning whether I was dreaming or if this was some kind of bizarre fantasy. But as soon as I felt Martin's warm, strong hands gripping my hair, that doubt evaporated. This was real, and I was right in the middle of it. The sensations overwhelmed my senses. Every touch felt electric, sending shivers down my spine. The feel of his skin was warm and slightly damp against my hands, and it was intoxicating. I could feel the power in his body, every muscle taut and alive. My hands moved instinctively, exploring the contours of his thighs, the solid mass of his calves, and the way his body responded to my touch. It was a strange mix of submission and dominance. Each touch was a silent conversation, a push and pull that left me breathless. Every time I glanced up at him, I caught that look in his eyes. The blend of lust and surprise mirrored my own feelings. It was like we were both in uncharted territory, figuring it out as we went along. I could see the appreciation on his face, a grin playing at the corners of his mouth, which only fueled my desire to please him more. I was hyper-aware of my every action, wanting to make the moment last, wanting to give him everything I could. His breathing became heavier, each inhale a reminder of just how real this was. The sounds of the apartment faded away, leaving just the two of us in our own world, cocooned in a bubble of heat and tension. I could feel the softness of his skin beneath my fingertips and the strong, steady pulse of his body. It was a dance, an interplay of control and surrender, and I was fully committed, lost in the throes of this unexpected experience. The more I worked with my hands, the more I found my own body responding to the heat of the moment. My palms slid over him, each touch igniting sparks of electricity, and I reveled in the knowledge that I was making him feel good. There was something powerful about knowing I was the one bringing him pleasure. It was intoxicating. The thrill of the situation, the connection between us, and the intimacy of the moment all collided in a beautiful chaos that I never wanted to end. My palms glided over his skin, fingers tracing the grooves of his muscles as I worked my way up his legs, each movement deliberate yet instinctive. There was a rhythm to it, a beat that matched the pounding of my heart. The weight of his body, the heat radiating from him, pulled me deeper into the moment. I could feel the tension in his muscles tightening under my hands, and it drove me wild. I was fully caught up in it, lost in this mix of desire and disbelief. In those seconds, I forgot everything else: the rain, the pandemic, the exhaustion of my day job. Okay, now let's finish with the novella. I hope you enjoyed my writing and artistic abilities. So there I was, on my knees in front of this guy, fully committed to what I was doing. It was like I had flipped a switch in my head, and all my usual hesitations were gone. The room was warm, his breathing was heavy, and I could feel every little movement he made. I was so focused on him, on how he was reacting, on how his body was tensing and relaxing as I worked. I had no idea I'd be in this situation when I woke up that day, and yet, somehow, I was right there, fully immersed. And when I finally took him in my mouth, I could feel his whole body tense up. His breathing turned into these deep, rough exhales, and he grabbed my hair, gently at first, but then harder as he got more into it. The pace picked up, and I could feel the heat building in the room, his grip on my hair tightening as he started moving in rhythm. I couldn't believe how turned on I was by the whole thing. It was like my body was reacting on instinct. It wasn't just that I was doing it, it was how I was doing it. I mean, I wasn't exactly inexperienced, but I had never been in a situation like this before. The power dynamic was off the charts. He was sitting there, this huge, muscular guy, totally in control, but at the same time, there was this undeniable attraction between us. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the moment, the heat, the tension, the feeling of being completely taken over by something way bigger than myself. He was gripping my hair tighter now, not hard enough to hurt, but just enough to let me know he was in charge. The sound of his breathing filled the room as I kept going, each exhale growing rougher, deeper. I could feel the pace picking up, his body moving with a rhythm that matched mine. And the way he leaned back, his abs tensing and flexing with each movement, it was almost hypnotic. There was something about seeing someone so powerful in that kind of vulnerable moment that really got to me. His hand on my head started to guide me more forcefully, his hips lifting slightly off the couch as he set the pace. I wasn't even thinking at that point. Everything was automatic, instinctual. My hands were on his thighs, feeling the solid muscle beneath his skin as he moved. I could sense he was getting close, the way his body was tightening up, his grip on my hair becoming more insistent. I remember this strange mix of nervousness and excitement bubbling up inside me, but I was too far into it to stop. And then it happened. He reached his peak, and I could feel it building before it actually hit. His whole body tensed, his muscles tightening in this powerful way as he released. The next few seconds felt like a blur. There was this intensity in the air, like time had slowed down for just a moment. And then, as quickly as it started, it was over. I felt the warmth hit my face, and yeah, I wasn't exactly prepared for that, but it didn't even matter. Afterward, he slumped back into the couch, breathing hard, and I sat there for a second, trying to process everything. My heart was still pounding, my face flushed from a mix of physical exertion and the sheer intensity of what had just gone down. It was like the room had its own pulse, the energy still lingering in the air, even though we had both come down from the high. I didn't know what to do next. I mean, it wasn't like this was some normal situation where you shake hands and say, thanks. I was still on my knees, wiping my face with the back of my hand, unsure of what to expect. But then, something surprising happened. Instead of just telling me to leave or tossing me the cash, like I was some kind of transaction, Martin reached down and pulled me up to my feet. I was expecting something cold or detached, but he actually leaned in and hugged me. And not in that awkward, thanks for the service kind of way, but a genuine soft hug. His arms were strong around me, and for a moment it felt kind of comforting. Like, despite the rawness of what had just happened, there was still a sense of connection. It was weirdly intimate in a way I hadn't expected. He held me there for a few seconds, his body still warm and a little slick from earlier, and then he pulled back and told me to follow him to the couch. I was still a bit dazed, but I did what he said, sitting down next to him. My mind was racing, but at the same time, I felt strangely calm. Like, yeah, this had just happened, but it didn't feel wrong. It felt natural in a weird way. Maybe it was the exhaustion from the rain and all the late deliveries, or maybe it was just the sheer intensity of the situation, but I was kind of riding this high, both mentally and physically. He laid back on the couch, stretching out, and then asked me to give him a massage. It wasn't a demand, more like a request, but with that same energy of someone who knows they're going to get what they want. I was still processing everything, so I just nodded and got to work. I moved down to his legs and started kneading the muscles there. His body was insane, like every part of him was sculpted. I could feel the tension in his legs as I worked, my fingers digging into the tight muscle, and it was kind of therapeutic, not just for him, but for me too. He groaned softly as I worked, telling me that I had magic hands or something like that, and honestly, I didn't even care if it was flattery. I was getting paid, and on top of that, I was in this weirdly satisfying situation that I didn't want to end. His body relaxed more and more under my hands, and I felt like I was in some sort of trance. The whole thing was surreal. I never expected this kind of thing to happen in real life, especially not to me, a pizza delivery guy just trying to get through the day. And yet, here I was, massaging this rich, hot older guy after, well, you know, life's funny like that. After a while, he shifted slightly and looked at me with this lazy, satisfied smile. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a couple more $100 bills, and handed them to me. $200. For what? Half an hour of my time. If I'd been blown away by the $100 tip earlier, this was on a whole new level. It wasn't just the money though, it was the whole experience. I felt like I'd just unlocked some hidden part of life that no one tells you about. Like, yeah, it was unexpected, but in a good way. I'd do it again in a heartbeat, no question. He asked for my number before I left, and I gave it to him without hesitation. I knew right then and there that this wouldn't be the last time I saw him. I mean, $200 for a massage and, well, everything else? You'd be crazy to say no. As I got dressed and gathered up my things, I couldn't help but feel this weird sense of excitement bubbling up inside me. This was the start of something, even if I didn't know what it was yet. I left his apartment feeling like I had just stepped into a whole new world. And you know what? Remember I left him my number? Well, on Friday afternoon, when I was in the middle of my courier work, sweating, dodging traffic, barely keeping up with my schedule, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was an unknown number, so I almost didn't answer it, thinking it might be a scam or a wrong number. But something in me, a tiny voice of hope, or maybe just sheer boredom, made me swipe to pick up. And there it was, his voice, deep and smooth. Hey, it's Martin. You free tonight? I was shocked. No, really, the kind of shock where you're not sure if you're still awake or if you've slipped into some midday daydream. I had half convinced myself he'd forgotten me, that our first meeting was just a fleeting moment for him. But here he was, sounding as casual and commanding as ever. He didn't even wait for my stuttered answer before adding, "Be ready at 6, neat and dressed up. A taxi will pick you up." Click. Just like that. I stared at my phone, the screen dimming as the call ended, the little icon of my next delivery blinking in the background. My heart raced. What did he mean by neat and dressed up? I had an old shirt that wasn't too creased and some black pants from my prom that were barely surviving at the back of my closet. it would have to do. The rest of my shift was a blur of rushed deliveries and me checking the time every 5 minutes. I kept running through our first meeting in my head. The intensity of it, how he looked at me like he saw right through my skin, right into my thoughts. But this felt different, less spontaneous and more, I don't know, planned. My stomach twisted in anticipation, half nerves, half excitement. By the time I got home, I had maybe 45 minutes to pull myself together. I dove into my closet, nearly tearing apart the shelves until I found that old shirt. A quick sniff check, a hasty ironing job that mostly just steamed my bathroom mirror, and a swipe of deodorant later, I was good to go. Well, as good as someone like me could be for an evening that promised to be anything but ordinary. At exactly 5:58 p.m., there was a honk outside. I peeked out the window to see a sleek, dark-colored taxi waiting at the curb. The driver wasn't the usual chatty type. He barely nodded as I climbed in, nervously tugging at my shirt collar. We drove towards the city center, weaving through familiar streets that felt different tonight, buzzing under the soft glow of the evening lights. My palms were sweating so much that I kept wiping them on my pants, trying not to think about what was waiting for me. When we pulled up in front of a fancy restaurant, one of those with names that people say in a hushed tone, I swallowed hard. My last restaurant experience had been prom night, where the fanciest thing we ordered was mozzarella sticks. But this place was all crystal glasses and softly lit chandeliers, with staff that looked like they were trained to judge who belonged and who didn't. I felt like I had first-timer written all over my face as I stepped inside. The cool air and faint scent of herbs and freshly baked bread hit me, grounding me just enough to keep walking. And then I saw him, Martin, sitting at a table near the window, dressed in a tailored suit that fit him too well to be off the rack. He was turned slightly, watching the street outside, but when he saw me, he smiled. Not a big smile, just a small one that said he was glad I showed up. That smile did things to me insides I can't even begin to explain. "Peter," he said, standing up. His voice was smooth, carrying across the room without being loud. He reached out a hand, and I took it, feeling the warmth of his palm, firm but not crushing. I probably looked like a deer caught in headlights. "Glad you made it," he added, a little more softly, before gesturing for me to sit. I did, trying not to knock over the fancy cutlery laid out in an order that I couldn't begin to decipher. Wine was poured, dark red and richer than anything I'd ever tasted before. I took a sip, trying not to cough as the taste, deep and slightly bitter, settled on my tongue. Martin was watching me, one eyebrow raised as if he could see right through the nerves. "You look good," he said, and I nearly laughed at that, glancing down at my thrown-together outfit. But the way he said it made me feel like I did look good, or at least like he didn't care about the wrinkles on my shirt or the fact that my shoes had seen better days. The food came out in courses, each one more extravagant than the last. I didn't know half of what I was eating, but it was incredible. At one point, Martin leaned back, swirling his wine glass and watching me pick at something with a name I couldn't pronounce. "You always eat like you're not sure if it's real," he said with a smirk. I blushed, looking away and trying to muster up a cool retort, but my mouth wouldn't cooperate. We talked, or rather, he talked, and I stumbled through answers. He asked about my work, about the random details of my life. And each question made me feel like he was trying to piece together something in his head. I asked him things too, careful not to overstep, and learned that he lived a life that seemed a world apart from mine. Business trips, properties, and stories that sounded like they belonged to someone on TV. But he told them in a way that made them feel less intimidating, more like confessions than boasts. By the time the plates were cleared and the wine had warmed me up enough that my nerves settled, he looked at me with that same intense gaze I remembered from our first meeting. "Ready to go?" he asked, and it wasn't really a question. My heart thumped a little harder, a mix of anticipation and an electric charge that ran from my chest down to my fingertips. The night air was crisp when we stepped outside. He guided me to his car, sleek, dark, fitting the whole picture, and I slid into the passenger seat. The city lights blurred as we drove, my eyes flicking to him every so often. He drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting near the gear shift, relaxed, like he'd done this 1,000 times. The realization hit me as we pulled into his driveway, a sprawling place hidden behind tall hedges and a gate that clicked open with a quiet hum. We got out, and before I could even process the change from car to hallway, he was close, really close. His hand came up, not to grab or pull, but to rest just at the back of my neck, his thumb brushing the skin there as if he'd missed touching me. "I couldn't stop thinking about you," he said, almost a growl. Before I could say anything, he leaned in and the world tilted. All I could do was hold on as the evening became a blur of skin and warmth and whispers. That's right, that's how it was. We went home, and it felt like I was stepping into a space that was both intimidating and inviting. The second the door clicked shut behind us, he was on me, not rough or hurried, but with a kind of focused urgency that made my pulse skip. His hand moved to the back of my neck, fingers pressing just enough to make me feel the strength behind them. He leaned in, close enough that I could feel his breath, warm against my skin, before he took a slow inhale, as if memorizing my scent. "I missed you," he said, voice low and deep, and it sent a shiver down my spine. It felt like he'd been holding back all week just to say those words, to do this. I didn't have time to answer before his lips found mine, and whatever small talk or nerves were left in me disappeared into that kiss. It was different this time, not rushed like the first time, not driven purely by the novelty of something new. This was slower, more deliberate, like he wanted to take in every detail, every reaction. His lips were warm and commanding, and I found myself melting into him, letting him guide the moment. It was like he knew exactly how to balance that line between gentle and insistent, each move making my skin tingle. Before I knew it, I was on my knees again, right there in the hallway. It felt almost symbolic, like we'd rewound to that first night, but with all the uncertainty stripped away. Martin's eyes were locked on mine the whole time, intense and unblinking. There was something about the way he looked at me that made me feel exposed, like he could see everything I was thinking and feeling, and wasn't about to let me hide any of it. His hand rested on my jaw, not pushing, just holding me there, grounding me. The hallway felt like it shrank around us, like there was nothing in the world except the two of us and the muffled sound of the city outside. The way he held me was steady, his breath hitching just enough for me to know that he was as affected as I was. Every sound he made, every shift in his expression, pulled me in deeper. I could feel the tension in his body, the way he was restraining himself from just letting go. He didn't look away, not once, and I didn't want him to. It was like some silent communication, an unspoken understanding that this was as much about trust as it was about touch. At some point, the world shifted again, and suddenly I was being lifted. Martin's arms were strung around me, lifting me like I weighed nothing, and he carried me over to the couch. It felt like I was floating for a moment, caught between the firmness of his hold and the rush of blood in my ears. He set me down gently, leaning over me, his eyes scanning my face like he was committing it to memory. Then, without breaking eye contact, he kissed me again, his lips trailing down my jaw, then lower to my neck. I could feel the heat radiating from him, his stubble grazing my skin and sending little sparks shooting down my spine. His hands roamed over my body, not missing an inch, mapping out the planes of my chest and the line of my abs like he was discovering something precious. There was something reverent about it, almost tender, which only made it feel more intense. When his lips moved down, following the path of his hands, I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. It was overwhelming in the best way, each touch deliberate, like he was savoring every reaction I gave him. Then he turned me around, and there was a pause, just a moment where he rested his hand on the small of my back. It was grounding, a silent reminder that he was there, that this was real. I tried to relax, focusing on the feel of his breath against my shoulder, the way he murmured something, too low for me to catch, before pressing forward. It wasn't easy, it never was. But he was patient, easing me into it, his hands slipping around to grip mine, fingers laced together in a way that felt oddly reassuring. His movements were slow at first, careful, like he was testing the waters. I could feel the tension in my body slowly start to dissolve as he set a rhythm, each shift sending a ripple of sensation through me. He stayed close, his chest pressed to my back, his breath hot against my ear. It was overwhelming in a way that made it hard to think straight, every touch amplifying the connection between us. When he whispered my name, low and rough, it sent a shock of heat through my veins. He didn't rush, and I felt each moment like it was stretched out, every small shift and change in rhythm hitting just right. It was the kind of closeness that made everything else fall away. His body moved in sync with mine, and I could feel the steady drum of his heartbeat against my back, matching the pulse in my ears. He was so into it, completely immersed, and that only made it more intense for me. When he finally let go, a shudder running through his body, he slumped next to me on the couch, breathing hard. There was a moment of silence where neither of us moved, the only sound the ticking of a clock somewhere in the room and the echo of our breathing. Then he turned his head to look at me, one corner of his mouth lifting in a small, satisfied smile. "That was," he started, but then he just let out a breath, like words weren't enough. He sat up slowly, stretching his arms out with a sigh before glancing back at me. "Lie down," he said, a hint of playfulness returning to his voice. I gave him a questioning look, and he smirked. "Your turn to take care of me." I moved over, straddling his back, my fingers pressing into the muscles of his shoulders. They were firm, built from years of who knows what, probably gym sessions I couldn't even imagine. I needed the tension out of him, feeling the shift in his posture as he relaxed under my touch. He let out a low hum of appreciation, and I realized just how much I liked seeing him like this, how much I enjoyed that I could make him feel good in a different way. At some point, his breathing slowed, his body growing heavier under my hands. I leaned forward, and sure enough, his eyes were closed, his face softened with sleep. I couldn't help but smile, settling down beside him. I hadn't expected that, hadn't thought we'd just fall asleep like that, tangled together on the couch. But we did, and it felt strangely perfect, like the night had ended exactly how it was supposed to. The last thing I remember before drifting off was the sound of his breathing, deep and even, and the warmth of his arm draped over me, anchoring me in place. I woke up early in the morning, the kind of early where the world is just a dim, quiet outline of itself, and everything feels a little unreal. My head was still foggy, and it took a second to remember where I was, why I wasn't in my own bed with the morning sun sneaking through my broken blinds. But then I shifted, and the arm draped over me reminded me. I glanced to my side, and there he was, Martin. His chest rising and falling in that steady rhythm of deep sleep, the lines of his face softened, almost boyish in the dawn light. It was the first time I'd really taken a moment to look at him, just lying there, not the confident, commanding man I'd gotten used to, but just human. And older. The creases at the corners of his eyes, the slight silver threading through his hair, stood out more in the quiet morning. For a split second, I felt this strange dissonance, like I'd stepped into a scene that wasn't mine. A 50-year-old man lying next to me, the faint scent of cologne and sweat still clinging to us. It hit me in a way that made my stomach twist. But then I remembered how the night before had felt, his touch, the way he'd looked at me, the ease that followed everything. And the twist in my stomach turned warm. I sat up slowly, careful not to wake him, and slipped off the couch. My legs felt sore, a reminder of the night that pulled a smile from me even as I winced. The kitchen was easy to find. The layout of his house was modern, open, and intimidatingly spotless. It felt strange stepping into it, like being in a showroom. I found a glass, filled it with water, and leaned against the counter, the coolness of the marble biting into my palms. I sipped, trying to piece together my thoughts. The night had been intense, yes, but also different from any other time I'd been with someone. There was an unspoken trust, an understanding that neither of us had voiced, but it was there in every touch, every shared look. I was still lost in my thoughts when I heard him walk in. I didn't turn right away, just listened as he moved, his bare feet making a quiet sound on the tile. He didn't say anything at first, just came up behind me, the air shifting with his presence. For a second, I thought he'd go for the casual morning after brush off. But then he stepped closer and placed a warm hand on the counter beside me, just close enough for his arm to graze mine. "Good morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep and something else, something softer. I turned to look at him, and he was already looking at me, one corner of his mouth lifting like he was amused by something. He was still shirtless, wearing only a pair of lounge pants that hung low on his hips. I could see the defined lines of his chest and abs, the way the muscles moved as he shifted his weight. "Morning," I replied, my voice sounding small in comparison. There was a beat of silence where we just looked at each other, neither of us moving, and I wondered if he could hear how fast my heart was pounding. Finally, he gave a small nod, like he'd come to a decision. "Sit down. You need breakfast," he said, already moving towards the fridge. It wasn't a question, and I found myself obeying without thinking, sliding onto one of the high stools at the island. I watched as he pulled out eggs, butter, and a handful of other ingredients, his movements practiced and precise. The kitchen smelled like warm butter and spices within minutes, and the familiarity of it was almost jarring. It felt domestic, normal, even. Like waking up at a partner's place and having them make you breakfast was something I did every weekend. He cracked the eggs into a bowl, glancing at me as he whisked them with a practiced hand. "You okay?" he asked, and I could hear the shift in his tone, the slight edge of concern that I didn't expect. Was I too rough? I blinked, the question surprising me as much as the fact that he was asking it at all. I shook my head, a smile breaking out despite myself. "No, not at all. Last night it was good. It felt inadequate, but it was the truth." His eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite name before he looked back down at the pan, nodding as if he'd just confirmed something to himself. When the scrambled eggs were done, he plated them and slid one in front of me before sitting across from me with his own. We ate in comfortable silence, the only sounds the clinking of forks and the occasional hum of a car passing outside. I felt the awkwardness that usually comes with mornings like this. Uncertainty, questions unasked, starting to creep in, but Martin cut through it with the ease that seemed to be second nature to him. He stood up then, taking our plates to the sink and rinsing them. I watched his back muscles move under his skin, the way he carried himself so easily. When he turned back to me, his eyes softened, and he cocked his head towards the hallway. "Feel like taking a shower?" I knew that question wasn't just about cleaning up. The way his gaze held mine, the slight upward curve of his lips, it was an invitation. I nodded, and he reached out a hand, pulling me to my feet and leading me down the hall. The bathroom was like the rest of his place, sleek, modern, with dark tiles and a glass-enclosed shower that looked big enough to fit 3 people. He turned on the water, testing it until steam began to rise before stepping back and pulling me with him under the spray. The hot water hit my skin, a sudden rush that made me gasp, but he steadied me with a hand on my hip. He reached for the soap, lathering it between his hands before running them over my chest in slow, deliberate circles. The way he touched me wasn't rushed. It felt like he was taking his time, relearning the shape of me. The water streamed down, mixing with the soap and making a frothy path down our bodies. I took the washcloth from him, sliding it across his broad shoulders and down his arms, feeling the strength there, the way the muscles flexed under my touch. The silence was broken only by the sound of water splattering and the occasional soft sigh when my hand brushed a sensitive spot. When I ran the cloth over his chest, he reached up, catching my wrist and pulling me close. The water cascaded between us, and for a moment, all I could focus on was the heat of his body pressed against mine, the steady thump of his heart under my palm. "Peter," he murmured, voice barely audible over the rush of water. He didn't say anything else, just leaned in to press a kiss to my forehead, then down to my lips, slow and thorough. His hands roamed my back, sliding up to tangle in my hair, and I couldn't help but shiver even in the warmth of the shower. He turned me around so that my back was against his chest, and I could feel every inch of him, every rise and fall as he breathed. He reached for the soap again, lathering it and running his hands over my skin, slow, almost reverent. The water carried the soap away, leaving a clean, warm trail in its wake. His fingers traced the lines of my shoulders, the dip of my waist, moving lower and then back up, as if to memorize every part of me. I closed my eyes, letting myself sink into the feeling of being surrounded, held in a way that felt safe and right. His lips found the side of my neck, pressing kisses that made my breath catch. The steam clouded the glass walls around us, turning the outside world into a hazy blur that felt a million miles away. It was just us here in this moment. When he pulled me tighter, one arm wrapping around my waist, I leaned into it, feeling the steady thrum of life in him and in myself. There was something grounding in that embrace, something that went beyond physical attraction. The water continued to flow over us, rinsing away the remnants of the night before, but leaving behind a feeling that was harder to wash away, something real, something that made me want to stay just a little longer, to let this moment stretch on forever. Martin pressed a final kiss to my shoulder before turning off the water. The sudden silence was almost deafening, broken only by the sound of droplets hitting the floor as we stepped out. He handed me a towel, his eyes crinkling slightly as he smiled, and I couldn't help but smile back. Yes, guys, so here we are in the heart of autumn, where the leaves crunch underfoot and the chill bites a bit harder. I'm still working as a courier, running around the city with that familiar weight on my back, but now there's this extra layer to my life, Martin. We still meet a couple of times a month, like clockwork. It's become a rhythm, one that's as familiar as my delivery routes. It's strange, this balance we've found. He's rich with that sharp, classic look that turns heads even at his age. He's got everything people usually spend their whole lives trying to get. A big house with a view, a car that purrs like a lion, and the kind of wardrobe that probably costs more than my entire year's rent. But despite all that, he's lonely. He'd never say it outright, but it's there, in the way he holds me just a bit tighter when I'm about to leave, or the way he insists on cooking breakfast for me after a long night, sitting there watching me eat like he's memorizing it. I know what you're thinking. There's no way this doesn't get complicated, right? But for now, it's not. It's this strange mix of transactional and genuine. He pays me, yeah, and the money is good. Better than good, actually. But it's not just about that. There's an understanding between us, an unspoken agreement. I brighten up his lonely weekends, bring some warmth into that big empty house, and in return, he makes sure I'm taken care of. It's not love, at least not the kind of love people write sonnets about. But there's something there. Something that feels safe, reliable, and, dare I say, needed. When the weekends roll around and he texts me, it's always short and to the point. Tonight? And I know what he means. I show up, and for those few hours, or that night, we both get to forget about what's missing in our own lives. We share wine, stories, jokes. Hell, we even sit out on his balcony sometimes and just listen to the wind moving through the trees. It's a strange kind of comfort, one that I've grown to look forward to. And who knows where it'll go. Maybe it'll fade out when the seasons change, or maybe it'll keep going, turning into something more or something else entirely. But for now, I'm okay with it. He's a good man, genuinely, and we both fill a gap that the other didn't realize was so deep. So yeah, I'm still out here hustling with my courier job, my life moving fast, street by street, delivery by delivery. But now, tucked into the corners of those busy days, there's this other life shared between two people who found each other at the right moment, even if it doesn't fit any easy definition. And maybe that's enough. For now it is. Let's see where it all goes.